C'est super, merci d'avoir pris ce temps en fait pour venir participer à cet échange qui pour nous paraissait très important, qu'on a intitulé, vous l'avez vu en fait, contre le génocide à Gaza, contre l'impérialisme, pour une Intifada globale, sauf à Paris, point d'interrogation. Parce qu'évidemment, pour toutes les personnes qui, depuis un an, ont essayé justement de résister à toutes les offensives idéologiques, politiques, à la répression, pour faire preuve de solidarité avec le peuple de Gaza, et en fait, c'est une question qui nous a forcément tous et toutes interpellés, de voir qu'il y avait dans différents pays du monde d'énormes élans de solidarité, et des pays qui arrivaient à mettre des centaines de milliers de personnes dans les rues, notamment à Londres, où ça a culminé avec une manifestation de 1 million de personnes. Et donc, forcément, on se pose la question de qu'est-ce qui a permis ça dans un pays comme l'Angleterre, et du coup, quelle expérience on peut en tirer pour essayer d'aller vers ça aussi ici. Juste pour dire quelques mots de la façon dont on va organiser la soirée. Donc, Gaëlle et moi, on propose de l'animer. Donc, moi, je suis Vanina. Je milite dans le 20e, dans le collectif Urgence Palestine Paris 20e. Et Gaël, lui, pareil, est un camarade A2C qui milite à Montreuil, dans le collectif Montreuil-Palestine. Et du coup, je ne vais pas prendre beaucoup de temps parce qu'on est tous et toutes là pour écouter Sophia. Peut-être juste revenir sur un peu des pistes qui vont permettre d'amorcer la discussion. En réalité, on est face un peu à deux types d'interprétations possibles sur les différences qui peuvent exister d'un pays à l'autre. Le premier type d'interprétation sur lesquelles en fait on a peu de prise finalement, c'est aussi d'expliquer que les difficultés auxquelles on est confronté en France relèvent beaucoup justement de toute cette offensive à laquelle on doit faire face depuis le 7 octobre, c'est-à-dire de résister aux interdictions de manifestation, de résister à l'injonction permanente de condamner justement les actes du 7 octobre. Sinon, on risque, et c'est ce qui se passe pour un certain nombre de militantes et de militants, d'être en procédure pour apologie terroriste. Enfin, on essaye de résister en permanence à ça, et du coup c'est ça aussi qui rendrait beaucoup plus difficile d'étendre les mobilisations. Mais finalement, peut-être Sophia sera, dans une partie de son topo, susceptible de nous raconter justement à quel niveau la répression, l'offensive idéologique, etc. est présente aussi en Angleterre. Il peut y avoir aussi des interprétations, par exemple, on a réussi en France, je ne sais pas si vous vous souvenez, en mai-juin, avec des dizaines de milliers de personnes en manifestation sauvage, alors de mobilisation qui s'était étendue après l'occupation de l'université de Columbia, des occupations justement de différents campus qui sont arrivés juste en France et qui ont permis de retrouver cet élan un peu de la confiance dans notre capacité à changer les choses. Et puis sur ça arrive quoi? Arrive l'annonce de Macron de la dissolution, donc cette idée qu'on est aussi pris par une série d'événements politiques qui nous affectent et qui nous obligent à faire des choix militants, etc. Et que du coup ça rendrait aussi un peu difficile d'arriver à étendre le mouvement de solidarité en France. Il n'empêche que là, pareil, quand on met un peu en regard ce que je viens d'expliquer avec ce qui se passe en Angleterre, ça contrebalance un peu ce type d'explication, parce qu'en Angleterre, vous avez peut-être suivi l'actualité, il y a aussi les fachos qui sont en embuscade, il y a aussi Tommy Robinson qui a été capable de mettre des dizaines de milliers dans la rue, il y a eu des émeutes fascistes au mois d'août, et ça n'a pas empêché en Angleterre d'avoir une manifestation extrêmement réussie le 5 octobre, avec 300 000 personnes. Donc pareil, il y a à voir un petit peu ce qu'on en retire. Alors si on se dit que ce type d'explications ne sont pas forcément les bonnes boussoles, les bonnes analyses, en fait, il y aurait d'autres types d'explications, c'est de regarder aussi dans le champ associatif, syndical, politique, quelles ont été les analyses, quelles sont les boussoles, quelles ont été les réactions en fait qui ont dominé en France et qui peut-être sont des obstacles à notre capacité à faire qu'on amplifie la mobilisation. Et sur ça, il y a peut-être trois choses sur lesquelles je voulais, porter l'accent. Déjà, les réactions par rapport au 7 octobre. Encore une fois, je parlais de cette injonction à condamner le Hamas, mais finalement, il y a eu aussi un certain nombre de militants qui se sont retrouvés, d'ailleurs beaucoup dans l'urgence Palestine, à dire qu'il ne fallait pas céder à cette injonction pour pouvoir développer la solidarité. Mais ça a été aussi un processus qui a été compliqué, parce que ce qui a dominé, c'est pas cette analyse-là. La deuxième chose, c'est que, en fait, dans ce mouvement de solidarité, il y a eu besoin, à des moments, justement, de pouvoir... j'essaye de me souvenir. Oui, il y a eu besoin à des moments d'affirmer certaines choses. Et donc, en même temps que nous, on était en train d'essayer de résister à cette offensive, ces interdictions de manifester, cette injonction à condamner le Hamas, etc. Et je ne sais pas si vous vous souvenez, un mois plus tard, en fait, il y a eu cette offensive de la part du gouvernement, rejoint par les républicains et par les fascistes, de manifester, donc un appel qui datait un mois après le 7 octobre, donc le 7 novembre, d'aller manifester contre soi-disant contre l'antisémitisme, mais en fait avec les pires racistes, et malheureusement une partie de la gauche a accepté en fait ce rassemblement, cette manifestation, donc avec les pires racistes, donc voilà, finalement une manifestation de soutien à Israël et par ailleurs une manifestation de racisme et une manifestation qui a développé le racisme en France, c'est-à-dire un climat d'islamophobie. Et la troisième chose que je voulais dire sur les boussoles un peu plus générales de stratégie, aussi quelle vision on a pour pouvoir gagner. Parce que c'est aussi ça qui doit nous animer, c'est comment on fait pour gagner. Comment on fait pour gagner non seulement la fin du génocide à Gaza, mais aussi casser en fait ce soutien des grandes puissances à Israël. Et du coup, sur ces boussoles un peu plus générales, je voudrais juste prendre l'exemple, parce que moi je l'ai vu il n'y a pas longtemps, et moi je me suis vraiment retrouvée dans cette idée-là, de cette boussole un peu stratégique, d'une personne en Angleterre qui a participé à une manifestation palestine et qui expliquait pourquoi il était devenu, dans ce processus-là, un militant révolutionnaire. Et il expliquait qu'en fait, au départ, quand on se retrouve à devoir manifester sa solidarité face à un génocide, la tâche, elle nous paraît énorme. Elle nous paraît tellement énorme que le premier réflexe peut être de se dire il va falloir gagner le changement en gagnant des positions dans des partis, en gagnant des positions dans les médias, en gagnant des positions dans les institutions. Et ce que lui explique, c'est qu'à partir d'un idéal qui est celui de l'humanité, qui est celui de l'égalité des droits, qui est celui de l'émancipation, du combat contre l'oppression, en fait, vouloir gagner ces positions-là, ça nous amène sur un chemin où on doit faire en permanence des compromis. Et si un jour on se retrouve enfin en situation de pouvoir réellement changer les choses, en fait, on ne fait plus partie de la solution, on devient le problème. Et ça, c'est une boussole assez générale, à mon avis, qui doit nous guider, justement sur l'idée que pour pouvoir mettre fin au génocide à Gaza, pour pouvoir gagner l'émancipation, il faut qu'on reste cramponné à notre classe et au fait que c'est notre classe qui aura la solution. Du coup, c'est un peu ça aussi, la boussole d'A2C. C'est aussi ce que je voudrais juste dire, parce que ça permet d'en parler, ça nous paraît très important. C'est aussi une boussole qu'une camarade qui s'appelle Suzanne Lemanceau a eu à cœur de développer pendant des années et des années. Suzanne Lemanceau, en fait, c'était une camarade qui a milité pendant très longtemps pour la libération de Georges Ibrahim Abdallah, qui est décédé. Il y aura un hommage demain soir au CICP à partir de 19h, donc n'hésitez pas à venir participer. Et par ailleurs, ça me permet aussi de vous inviter à participer le 26 octobre à la manifestation pour l'Almezan. Mais donc voilà un petit peu moi en guise d'introduction ce que je voulais vous dire. Après, on a pas mal de choses voilà, pour compléter ce que je viens de vous annoncer. Vous avez une table de presse là-bas, notamment avec des textes qu'on a rassemblés dans une brochure sur la solidarité avec la Palestine. Donc Sophia, c'est donc, comme vous l'aurez compris, une militante révolutionnaire en Angleterre qui participe à la campagne Palestine Solidarity Campaign et qui est aussi membre, dirigeante du SWP, Socialist Workers Party, donc parti révolutionnaire en Angleterre. Donc Sophia, c'est à toi. Merci d'être venue.
Awesome. Merci. And je suis très désolée that I do not speak French. But thank you for Jad. And I wanted to start by saying thank you to Autonomie de Classe for inviting me over, and it's a real pleasure to be speaking to people here in Paris about the movement in Britain, but also how we can try and galvanise the movement here in France. And I know we've just heard a little bit about why we're having this meeting, but I think it's also a very fitting time to have the meeting in the week that marks a year anniversary since October the 7th. And I think the last year has been transformative for millions of people worldwide. We have witnessed the worst crime of our lifetimes, and we have videoed it, I've seen it videoed on our screens. From the estimates are 42,000 Palestinians murdered. We know this is much higher, and now we face the threat of war in Lebanon, 2,000 dead in Lebanon, South Lebanon evacuated, and so on. And as I said, I think it's been transformative for millions of people, not just in Britain, but globally. I think the question, are you with the Palestinians against the onslaught of the Israelis? This question has drawn a line across the world, drawn a line between those on the streets, the students in the camps, the workers, and a line between the bosses, the Western imperialists, and the ruling classes across the world. And it is true that in Britain, the scale of the movement for the Palestinians has been extraordinary. It's taken us by surprise in Britain, quite the scale of the demonstrations and the size of them. Just this Saturday, on the 5th of October, the demonstration called by Stop the War Coalition, Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and a number of Muslim organisations was 300,000 strong in the streets of London. And this was the 21st national demonstration, and only one of them has been below 100,000 people in Britain. So clearly it is quite big. The statistics, they show that maybe 4 million people across Britain have taken part in some kind of demonstration, either in London or locally in their cities where they live. And surveys have said that 66% of people in Britain are for the Palestinians. Over half are for an end to all arms sales. But what I want to argue today is that there is nothing unique about British people. I think that this is the general mood across the world when it comes to what people want and what they see in terms of justice for Palestinians. And I think, just lastly, to say about the movement in Britain, what is significant is how long it has been sustained for, week in, week out, for a whole year. You have to go back to the time of the suffragettes, if not before, in the 1920s, 1910s, to see a scale or a movement this size. And it's not just big demonstrations in London, it is occupations of train stations, attacks on banks like Barclays who invest in arms companies. It is the university occupations and encampments that we've seen spread to over 40 different British universities. It is local fundraisers, targeting of government buildings, and occupations and targeting of arms factories, very significantly by a small militant organisation known as Pal Action. I think what is significant about the movement in Britain, as is in lots of places, it is not just made up of the Muslim or the Arab population. It's not just young, but everybody is part of the movement and the protests in London. And I think we have to ask then, when it is so big, how is it that after a whole year, we still see the same crimes every single day being waged on the streets? And I think this is the time where we have to say, we do not despair. It is right to be angry. However, this is a movement that has inspired millions of people globally, and I think is interlinked and has joined up revolutionaries and networks of people across the world. And it has the potential, I think, to be a movement that goes on the attack against Israel, but also the system of imperialism and ultimately the system of capitalism. Okay, so firstly then, well, why is it so big in Britain? And what are some of the problems that we faced? I think there are two reasons why the movement in Britain is significant. The first is because of the role of the British state and the history of complicity. You have to go back to 1917 and the Balfour Declaration, where Britain made apartheid. They gave the land to the Zionist settlers. And I think there is a mass amount of anger and an understanding of the unique role that Britain has played in Israel's genocide. And we've seen this continue today, the support of the British state. There's a lot of anger against Keir Starmer. On Monday, the 7th of October, Starmer released a statement. If you were to read the statement, you would have thought that the last year didn't happen. You would have thought that history started and finished with October 7th. It was a statement that was an apology or an open letter in support of the genocide. And this has caused a lot of anger because of the role that Britain has played as well for the last 76, 100 years of Israel's dispossession of the Palestinian people. But I think the second reason why it's big in Britain is because of the hard work and the legacy of the Stop the War movement and the demonstrations in 2003 against the Iraq War. Why has this been more significant? Well, at this time, when 1 million people marched on the streets of London in 2003, there was a big effort between the trade union movement, the British left, the anti-war movement, to make links and to work with the Muslim organisations in Britain. And that is a relationship that remains still today and has had a massive impact on galvanising and bringing out different sections of British society in the demonstrations that we've been witnessing over the last year. And this has been a key argument for the last 20 years in Britain. Why? Because outside of war, our government has targeted Muslims, has persecuted refugees, has a narrative of mass Islamophobia, and this is a role that I think the revolutionary left played in 2003 by arguing both Muslims and trade unionists and socialists and students have to come together to fight against the state that is attacking all different sections of society. So it's that key fusion. But despite this, there are problems, I think, just as with everywhere. There are two problems: the repression of the state and the media. I'll do them one by one. So the state repression has been vast. The previous government, the Conservative government, we had a very racist Home Secretary called Suella Braverman. She labelled the demonstrations as hate marches. She tried to ban the marches. On one occasion, she called out the fascists and the far right to protest against our march. It led to her resignation. And today, the Labour government does the same. Keir Starmer, he promises tougher prison sentences. On the demonstration on Saturday, there were a number of arrests for counter-terrorism, of people expressing support for the resistance. And this is a common theme. We've seen people face action in work. Students have been suspended at universities all across the country. And there is a real effort by the state to clamp down on the most radical elements of the movement. And of course, there are also problems with the media, like in France, like everywhere else. They try to label us as anti-Semitic. They are not supportive of us. However, the difference, I think, is that we have faced this argument for many years. When Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, they attacked him for anti-Semitism in 2017. In 2019, they attacked him again. And also the universities have faced mass repression for a decade. Why? Well, because the Zionists are very organised in the British universities, and they have quite high roles in student unions across the unis. This is the importance of having mass demonstrations on the streets to combat both the state repression in our numbers, but also the attacks from the media and from the right and the smears of anti-Semitism. It's the central importance of the huge mobilisations that we've had in Britain. But so, whilst it's been big, there are tensions within the movement about where next. There are arguments that happen on the streets when they say, how can you have 1 million people out on a demonstration and still nothing changes at the top of society? Still, Britain is complicit in genocide. We have not won, despite the size of the movement. And this is the struggle that I think we face here in Britain, but the same in France, the same in America, is the question of how do we win liberation for the Palestinians. And this tension exists between the top of the movement, the Stop the War, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, some of the trade union leaders who are more conservative in their efforts. They're more scared about the state repression. There's a tension between them and the militant activists on the ground. Hundreds of thousands of young, angry people who want to take more radical and escalate the action. And this is where there is a tension within the movement in Britain. And this is where I think the role of revolutionary organisation can come in. And it's interesting, I think, to say that in the Socialist Workers Party, we are far too small to shape the movement as a whole, but we've made some crucial contributions to try and relate to the most radical elements of the movement, whilst also fighting to build the demonstrations on the streets to be as big as possible. And I think as the war goes on, that radical minority, it gets bigger and bigger. The people who see this as a question of imperialism tied to the system. We've spoken a lot about Generation Palestine. I think Generation Palestine is global, and we've seen a whole layer of young people radicalized by the war, but they have come out of the Black Lives Matter movement, they've come out from the climate change movement. Really, there is a layer of people globally that see the issues of today as systemic within the economic system that we live under. So how have we tried to influence the movement or relate to this radical minority that gets bigger and bigger and draw them to questions of revolution? I think first is the question of political clarity. On October the 7th, we were the only people to say that the Palestinians have a right to resist Israeli apartheid by whatever forms they choose. And that is the line that we still say every single day since October the 7th. And this is not automatic. We were in isolation as revolutionaries on October the 7th. The Labour Party, the media, other organisations on the left, the trade union movement were quick to condemn the attacks that happened. We stood fast and said, actually, we stand with the Palestinians and we will not throw them under a bus when questioned about our position on the attacks. And secondly, we were the only ones to say that it did not start on October the 7th. This is a process of genocide that has happened for the last 76 years. And also we have been steadfast in our opposition to a two-state solution. Again, something that the trade unions in Britain have called for, the Labour Party and so on. We've always said that this is no solution as the radical left that we could support. And I think it's important to have had these strong political positions from the start, because the year has been transformative for lots of young people. Often as Marxists, we talk about ideas changing in struggle. And because of the brutality of Israel, because of the support of our governments, there is a whole layer of people who are being more won to the radical positions that we took on October the 7th. But we have also tried to take political initiatives on the ground to build the movement. Two examples. Today, there is a workplace day of action. It is backed by the trade unions. It's backed by the TUC, the Trade Union Congress, the amalgamation of all the trade unions in Britain. It means nothing. The trade unions, they don't mobilise, but we have fought for our members to take small action in workplaces alongside students in universities. This has happened today in Britain. But I think that layer of people we've been able to win to our political arguments and through the actions, that layer of angry people exists everywhere. The people who want more than a ceasefire, the people who do not want a two-state solution, the people who want actually more than an end to the genocide, but really there are masses of people who want a liberated Palestine from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea. And I think that is the layer of people that us on the left have to win, to organise and to work with, to try and escalate the movements globally. But I want to finish with my last point really about where next for the movement in Britain and the lessons that we can generalise from. Because the shape of the movement in Britain has changed in the last 2 months, and that is because we now have a Labour government who is enacting the genocide. People, they expected it of the Conservatives or of the Tories, and for some reason, people expect better from someone like Keir Starmer. And whilst people did rebel against Keir Starmer in the general election, there were Labour lost lots of votes, independent candidates won and so on. It is now clear how much he will continue to support the genocide in Palestine. And I think it has shaped the direction of anger of the movement in Britain, and it has made the question much sharper for a lot of us on the streets. And not only does the Labour government support genocide, But Keir Starmer is enacting austerity, he is implementing cuts, he is making life harder for working class people. He is also implementing state racism. The Labour Party has pledged to deport 14,000 refugees by Christmas. And I think we have to try and bring the anger of all of these three things together in our fight against Starmer. And when the Labour government does this, it gives confidence and votes to the right. In Britain, I'm sure people will know, it was mentioned, we have a fascist movement on the streets. It's small, it's growing, and we have right-wing populists in government with Nigel Farage and Reform UK, and they look to Le Pen, Rassemblement National, they look to the AfD in Germany, and that is the political projects that they want to continue in Britain. There were race riots in the streets in the summer, and this is the enemy that we're also confronting on the streets in Britain. And this is not disconnected from the Palestine movement. The far right in Britain, they use the Islamophobia of the British state to attack Palestine and to attack refugees. Tommy Robinson, the most infamous British fascist, he had a demonstration in London in the summer where he said, "This is what London should look like, not a Palestine flag in sight." So our final task then is to fuse the militancy, the size of the Palestinian demonstrations in Britain with the mass anti-racist movement. And we try to do this in the form of a militant united front that we call Stand Up to Racism. And I think this is a lesson that we can all take when we see the rise of the far right across Europe. The urgency of tackling Islamophobia, of tackling racism, and also building a militant movement that can defeat the fascists in Parliament, but also on the streets. And I think this is the role of the revolutionary left. As I said before, there is a whole generation of people that have been radicalized by the question of Palestine, that see the racism of Israel as connected to the system that we live under and see the need to fight against Israel. We now have the task of saying that our fight is against the racists in government in our own countries. Our fight is to protect the refugees, and our fight is to build a world where both Palestine can be free, but where we can actually get rid of the systems of imperialism, of capitalism that have created the conditions in the first place. There is lots more to say, but I will shut up because I've gone too long over. But yeah.
Et voilà, on redonne la parole à Sophia.
Well, thank you, merci beaucoup. And I'm sorry, there's no way I could come back on every single question. But I'll be here at the end, so please do speak to me afterwards. I think the first, a very direct question about the concrete examples of repression in Britain. There is lots. In the universities, we have had a large number of students suspended for their activities around the Palestine encampments. Many of our members cannot go to campus. Ironically, one of these is at the university called SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies. It has a very radical tradition, but has one of the worst repressive natures that we've seen in any British university. There's no protesting, they've stopped people wearing kafirs, and they have currently suspended seven students for Palestine activity. Also, somebody mentioned people being arrested for saying Intifada on demonstrations and so on. This has happened in Britain time and time again. I was arrested for calling for a global Intifada. Luckily, I was not charged. I asked the police officer if he could spell it, and he couldn't, and they let me go. But it's still a thing. It's still a thing that they do in Britain too. I think somebody asked a question about the strike movement that we saw in 2023, and if this has crossed over with the Palestine movement. Similarly, with the pensions, they have not fused or mixed. However, I think the strike movement in 2022 to 23 created a layer of young trade unionists who knew what it was or what it meant to take action at work. And they are the people who are leading on the Trade Union Day of Actions today. So there is a process, I guess, of transformation. Okay. And I think this links with the question about the illusions in the Labour Party. It is true that Tony Blair was a war criminal. It is true that lots of the left have no illusions. But for many ordinary people, you are told that you make change by voting in the right people. And because of the links that the Labour Party and the trade union movement have historically, people think that Starmer and the Labour Party are in the favour of ordinary working class people. And of course we were told Keir Starmer is a human rights lawyer, so how on earth could he have been or support a genocide? No one knows. Sorry, I've just lost my... And I think it links with the question of the trade union movement as well. Now that Labour is in government, the trade union leaders, they have a seat at the table. They get to speak to the government, which means they are more passive, and we have to work at the base of the trade unions to get any kind of action over pay, over racism, over Palestine. And somebody asked about how people feel. I think the first contribution, how people feel about the Labour government only suspending 30 arms licences. This is 30 out of 350 arms export licences. So people think it's a joke. It's nothing that represents they want to stop selling arms to Israel. And there are lots of good organisations like Workers for a Free Palestine who do grassroots activism on the ground that we work with, and I support them in everything that they do. Okay, final 2 minutes. Very important, the question of Islamophobia and the links with the Muslim organisations and the left that were made in 2003. How did we do it? It was through a very long and tedious process where revolutionaries argued within the trade union movement that the question of racism and Islamophobia was central to the attacks on workers and to the anti-war movement. And it was by revolutionaries in the unions going around systematically making the argument and then going to the Muslim community and saying and forming a united front. And that is what Stop the War was, a united front between the trade unionists, the revolutionary left and the Muslim communities. And it was a very hard process we had to fight for a long, long time in 2003. And today the fight for Islamophobia is incredibly important. It is ongoing. Islamophobic attacks are on the rise. Every single one of our prime ministers has been an Islamophobe. Boris Johnson, David Cameron, Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer. They have all attacked Muslims and refugees. And it's an argument we continue to make through Stand Up to Racism. And it's something we have to continue to fight for, because somebody mentioned Rassemblement National. They have 100 MPs. Reform UK, they only have 4. But Reform UK, they came second in 100 different seats. And if there was an election tomorrow, they would win a lot more, because how shit the Labour Party have been on the question of racism. And the final thing I want to say really is maybe I was too harsh. I think we have won lots of things. And it's right that contradictory consciousness exists amongst many working class people, but through a process of fighting against imperialism and a genocide, people have changed their minds and have been won to many political questions. And the question of politics matters when you're in a small revolutionary organisation, because it is how you keep your authenticity and gain respect, I think, in the wider movements. And the final thing, I think somebody asked, what is the next step? What can we do? The truth is, the genocide could end tomorrow if Israel agreed to a single, secular, democratic state with equal rights for Israelis, Palestinians, Jews, Christians, anyone who wanted to live there. Israel will never do that because of settler colonialism. That means we have to fight for a set of revolutionary politics that can break down imperialism in the Middle East, but can also break the links that we have here in the West. That is why I'm a revolutionary organising in Britain, and I think for us here in France, we have to go to the streets, build the movement, but fight for revolutionary organisation. So it's a lot for Chad. I would encourage people to join Autonomie de Classe and to get involved in a revolutionary organisation that can take on imperialism and capitalism.